Hello everyone, and welcome to 2020 Broto Art, Climate and Science. It's a conference, and you're joining us via the web for session number 1, Deep Time and Climate. My name is Ian Edwards, and I'm the producer and curator of this event. I'm glad you could join us from all over the world in our conversation exploring the nexus of art, climate, and science. This is our 3rd annual conference, and the theme this year is Deep Time, as in long horizon time, 1,000 years, billion years. How often is it that we think about the future in our planning today? Let's debate that. We're beaming in from our home base in Provincetown, beautiful Cape Cod in Massachusetts. I'm standing here in front of Pilgrim Monument, a monument to the Pilgrims' first landing here 400 years ago. 2020 is a commemoration year of that event, and it's really what inspired our look at deep time. Our session features Paul Brysiewicz, who is an engineer and philosopher and a big thinker from the Long Now Foundation. He looks at scales of 10,000 years. Jonathon Keats is a renowned artist and experimental philosopher. And his work is the Millennium Camera, working in 1,000-year increments. Hilairy Hartnett is a biogeochemist and oceanographer, and she's co-director at Arizona State University's Planet Works. She works in timescales of 1 billion years. So these Broto sessions are free, but we accept donations. If you find value, please think about a contribution. And we'd like to thank our sponsors, including the Provincetown Tourism Fund, Provincetown Economic Development Committee, Provincetown Cultural Council. So in this session, we wanted to establish what deep time means, by definition and by point of view, and where it overlaps with the climate crisis. And while this starts as a pre-recorded session for our presenters, it will be live for the Q&A session after. Please use the Q&A chat box to register your questions. So now, on with the session. Thank you. Hello everyone, and welcome to what is session 1 of Broto our Broto 2020 conference. Broto is a conference produced by me, and my name is Ian Edwards, and we look at art and climate and science in collaboration, trying to figure out innovative ways to think about these subjects. This year we have, our theme is deep time in terms of long horizon time, and sometimes the times that we live in. So today's session is exactly about that, time, deep time, and climate, and I'm thrilled to have on our call today, we have Hilairy Hartnett, who's the co-director of Arizona State University's Planet Works. We have artist-philosopher Jonathon Keats, who has a Millennium Camera and a whole lot of other thoughts about that topic. And I wanted to say special thanks to Paul Brysiewicz from the Long Now. He's director of development. And just to get us started, Nick, what is deep time?
Yeah, so technically deep time is a bit of a jargon concept that refers to geologic time. So, you might thinking about the next 100 years as thinking in deep time, but really we're talking about millions and billions of years. At the Long Now Foundation, the Long Now concept, which we're named after, is the next in the last 10,000 years. So it's a blink of an eye on the kinds of timescales that Hilary's working with, which I'm excited to hear about later. But for us, that 10,000 year timescale on both sides of this present moment is the timescale of civilization. So what we kind of are thinking is that if you have a challenge, it's only appropriate to meet that challenge with the kind of thinking that's commensurate in scope and in scale. And so if you have civilization scale challenges, we need to bring and develop civilization scale thinking. So the way we do that is sometimes by having conversations with scientists and learning what they've discovered about deep time and about civilization scale time. And a lot of times it's working with artists, because it turns out getting yourself to think on these long time scales of the next and last 10 millennia, this kind of thinking can be initiated by an encounter with a work of art, but it can also be initiated by an encounter with a natural phenomenon, like Hilairy was mentioning earlier in our prep call, the Grand Canyon being an amazing deep time clock that, again, people don't always think of it this way, but an encounter with these kinds of things, everything from bristlecone pine trees, Great Pyramids at Giza, kinds of cameras and artifacts and monuments that Jonathon's been working on. All of these things are ways of helping us think about time differently. And the reason why that matters is that if we can think about time scales that are expanded beyond a single human lifetime, we can start to perceive phenomena that manifest on these larger timescales. And so now I'm thinking of things like climate change or asteroid impacts, space exploration. There's a lot of things that just do not take place inside of the confines of a single human lifetime. So if we want to get an optimal grip on these things, we need to start thinking on appropriate time scales. And so I get the pleasure of talking to a lot of really interesting people through the Long Now Foundation. We're a nonprofit organization, if that hasn't been made clear yet. And we have a monument scale clock of our own. Jonathon's helping us with another clock that I hope you'll talk about a little bit today. We have a bunch of different things that we're throwing at this problem because we don't quite know exactly. There's no silver bullet for getting people to think on long time scales. But Hilairy, somehow you must have gotten really interested in long time scales. What was it that did it for you, and can you speak a little bit about your work?
How did I get excited about long time scales? That's a really good question, Nick. I am an earth scientist, and my training is in oceanography, and I work in modern processes, but those modern processes occur in sediments, and sediments are one of those spectacular things that builds up inexorably over time, a little bit by a little bit by a little bit. And so as I look at a sediment core, I'm looking backwards in time when I collect my samples. And now I'm an oceanographer in the desert at Arizona State University, and I work with lots of geologists and geoscientists and astrophysicists, and I've become much more comfortable with the idea of time on billions of years time scales, right? We talk about the Earth being 4.5 billion years old. We talk about the universe being 13 billion years old. Those are time scales that people really don't wrap their heads around very easily. But those time scales and processes that happened in Earth history early on have real implications for how we think about processes happening on the Earth now, the way the Earth has adapted to change. For example, one of my research projects is in the Archean. The Archean's a fancy name for a period of Earth history about 2.5 billion years ago. That's billion with a B. And it's when oxygen first evolved and filled our atmosphere. And while we need oxygen today to breathe, the organisms present in the Archean had never encountered it. And it turns out it's deadly toxic to most things that aren't used to it. Major environmental disaster at 2.5 billion years ago. These days, I also work on thinking about the Anthropocene, this modern era where humans are having a huge impact on our planet. And we have begun to frame the Anthropocene as another one of these major changes in the Earth's ecosystem. Not unlike the evolution of oxygen, we are now the evolution of humans, and we're affecting the planet just as drastically. And so I'm beginning to think about in my teaching and in my research and in my working with partners outside the academy, how do we begin to help people see that the Earth has weathered these transformations? It has been changed by them. Can we look at the way the Earth has responded to change in the past to begin to think about how the Earth and its people are going to respond to change in the future? And so that ties into climate change. It ties into teaching geology, but also teaching history. And so I think we do ourselves a favor as scientists, especially earth scientists, if we talk about it as history, because people resonate with history, right? Their family history, the history of the place where they live. And we can begin to help people get a grip on what do we mean by time. Billions of years takes a little while, but hundreds of years and thousands of years, people can build an understanding of what those scales mean. And I think that ties in directly to what you're talking about with civilization scale time.
Jonathon, what do you have to say about that?
I remain fascinated with all dimensions of time and remain engaged in all of my own work at every possible scale, every scale that I can possibly engage, because I think that ultimately they are interrelated in terms of how what we do in the moment might have an effect over multiple generations, and given the extreme leverage that we have in terms of our technologies, potentially over time spans much greater than that. So, in other words, it seems to me that right now, and by right now I mean in perhaps a long now sense of the present, that is to say, over the past several decades or even longer than that, we're in a period where we are significantly more powerful in terms of the effects of what we do than we have been in evolutionary time. And as a result, we are singularly, I think, ill-equipped to be able to understand and to be able to work with the power at our hands. So, therefore, it becomes important to be fluent in time in a way that allows for thinking simultaneously in the moment for the next generation and through deep time. And through deep time, I mean both deep time as construed by long now in a 10,000-year perspective of civilization, and also deep time in the geological sense, because the Anthropocene, which has been proposed as a new epoch, which is to say potentially something lasting in the span of millions of years, this is a way of recognizing that what we do today can actually have an impact over what even a geologist would consider to be deep time. And the challenge for us is to recognize how decisions in the moment might have this effect for the next generation over 10,000 years and over millions of years, where it is very easy to operate or to think in the moment. It is not so easy, but still not entirely impossible to think about way back when and therefore far in the future. But what is particularly difficult is to be able to have the linkages in terms of that thinking that allow for recognizing how behaviors and policies and decisions more broadly made right now need to relate to those that might have to accrue or have to evolve over time, over the time span of generations, and how that relates to this much deeper sense of time. So in other words, how to situate ourselves at all these scales simultaneously. That, I think, is the greatest challenge. And one of the privileges of being an experimental philosopher practicing within the art world is that I have no discipline whatsoever. I am effectively an amateur and a dilettante who is able to work across disciplines. I wouldn't say irresponsibly, because I try always to work with rigor, but with a degree of fluidity, perhaps, that allows me to mix things in ways that they aren't necessarily meant to go together or haven't been put together before, in order to be able to create prompts or heuristics or provocations that might get us into at least the mindset, or at least into the conversations that need to happen in terms of being able to operate at multiple scales simultaneously.
That's great. People have asked me, as producer of this particular conference, why deep time. And for people who don't know, Broto is based in Provincetown, Massachusetts, which was the first landing of pilgrims 400 years ago. And 2020 is an anniversary of the 400th anniversary of that landing. And the region here is looking at backward 400 years. And I keep thinking, what now all we know about what we know, how should we think about the next 400 years? So a lot of the sustainability conversation and climate change conversations that I've been having with people center around what we can do, and I think time is somewhat missing. Do any of you have a perspective on where this overlaps with the climate change crisis and how we might be able to think about climate differently through time?
I think there's a lot that fits into that, right? Because we're very tied to the idea of right now in our everyday lives, right? And maybe we think as far back as last summer or next winter. But as a climate scientist, it's very clear that it's taken hundreds of years to get to where we are in the current climate situation, right? This didn't evolve yesterday or last week. Excuse me. From a CO2 standpoint, it's easily the last 200 years or so. Though there's evidence for human action on the planet back 5,000 years, if you want to look at terraced agriculture, say, has been practiced for 5,000 years in China. We know that people have been moving sediment. But the manifestation of climate change as we know it today, right? Melting ice, rising sea level, increasing temperature. We've gotten to this stage over 200 years. And now we talk about it as a crisis and, oh, we have to do something about it. And some of the things we can do now, they will help. But solving this problem isn't going to happen, in 2022. It isn't going to happen with the next election cycle. It's going to be a long process to get out of it, too. And so people need to learn or to think about, how do I take the long view? How do I take the idea that what I do today, I will never see the effect of that, but it would be better for my children, it will be much better for my grandchildren. And in 100 years or 200 years, we won't have messed up the planet.
Right. Nick?
Yeah, developing that personal... Sorry, Ian.
No, I was going to say, go
over you. Developing that kind of personal connection to, I guess, what we can call the deep future, right, is one of the challenges that really initiated the Long Now Foundation. So this organization was founded in 1996. And you can imagine that most technologists that were around at the end of the 90s were really inspired by visions of the future. This idea that there was a future, and a lot of that stuff was just psychically hanging around the year 2000. So in 96, you're 4 years away from the future, and you don't have meals in pill form, you don't have flying cars, we've got a lot of problems that we need to address that we haven't really begun addressing in earnest. And so, Danny Hillis in particular, one of the major figures in like massive parallel computing towards the end of the 90s, realized that we needed a new symbol for the future. The same way the pyramids of Giza are an enduring symbol of the past, we needed something like that gives us this deep personal connection to the future and to the generations that are ahead of us. And he thought that we could do this with a monument scale clock. So the Long Now Foundation began with this monument clock getting designed to last and keep good time for 10,000 years. Brian Eno, the British musician, actually designed the bell chime sequence for this clock, such that every visitor on every date of the clock in the next 10,000 years is going to hear a bell chime that no human beings ever heard before or will ever hear again. It's specifically unique to that visit. And so it's this ephemerality that reminds you that you exist in this ephemeral space in the context of 10,000 years, and yet you're there, you're present for it, you're really connected to it, and the things that we do now are going to impact the next 400 generations. So it's interesting, Ian, that you mentioned that it's the 400th anniversary of Provincetown, because you can imagine that every single one of those years now, just fill that with a generation of humans, and that's going to get you to about 10,000 year time scale thinking. So, this clock project of ours is one attempt to try to find ways of getting people to unlock that part of their imagination that helps them see and really comprehend their impact on the future. But there's so many other ways to do it. In fact, and the clock is interesting in that it's positing a conception of time that's very linear. It's very fungible. Every hour is the same across 10,000 years. But of course, when you're a lived human being, when you're living a life, you know that every hour is not the same. An hour you're waiting in a doctor's office is different than an hour on a first date with somebody when you're really enjoying it. It's different than an hour working on, a big piece of art. And so what I've found really interesting, especially in my conversations with Jonathon, has been this discrepancy between embodied time and kind of abstract conceptual time. And so we have this clock project to speak to one of these understandings of temporality and our relationship to time. But Jonathon's got a really cool idea I'd like him to speak about a little bit if he feels like it, which we're working in conjunction with him, that really is kind of addressing the other side of this as well.
Well, I will take that as an invitation to talk a little bit about a project that was in many ways inspired by conversation with Long Now, specifically with Alexander Rose, the executive director, who also went to grade school with me, as it turns out. We knew each other back then and only fairly recently reconnected as a result of my being invited to give a talk at The Interval, which is the bar which also serves as the offices and a space where talks are given on I think about a bi-weekly basis at the Long Now Foundation. The project is engaging bristlecone pine trees as timekeepers. There happens to be, amongst the holdings of Long Now, a property on Mount Washington in Nevada that is it's adjacent to the Great Basin National Park and is the largest stand of bristlecone pine trees under private ownership. And bristlecones are remarkable for so many reasons, but one of them is they have this extraordinary longevity. They can live upwards of 5,000 years. And trees are natural calendars in the sense that they grow a ring every year, and you can count backward, and in fact this is used in archaeology quite a lot. There's a whole field of dendrochronology to be able to make calculations about when a house was built, for instance, and also in climatology it's important because you can see, as a result of differences in rainfall and temperature, differences in the width of one ring versus another. And so that phenomenon really struck me as being interesting because time as measured by the tree is both regular in the sense that there's one new ring every year, and irregular in the sense that the thickness varies. So the idea is to take both the regularity and the irregularity in hand and to embrace, in particular, the irregularity and to consider it to be the regularity. Or in other words, you might imagine putting a spiral of markers around a bristlecone pine tree, a sapling, and then allowing the tree to grow. And the average growth per year is about 1 millimeter in terms of the increase in girth. So, and that's a calculation based on what the climate is and what conditions locally are today. So put a spiral of markers around the tree where they are spaced in a way that is based on current growth, and mark the years anticipated that the tree will reach those markers, and then stand back and give the tree authority to tell us what time it is. And the tree will grow faster or more slowly depending on carbon dioxide level, rainfall, a whole bunch of different factors that are, some of them global, others local, and of course all interrelated at some level. And so what happens is that time becomes contingent in a sense, unpredictable by the standards upon which we typically operate, but the time also gains a ground truth, a way in which it is tied to the world in which we live and indicative of the world in which we live, and becomes potentially a means of observing that world at all levels, and therefore potentially even becomes a feedback mechanism by which to observe ourselves in relation to the world over that span of 5,000 years. That time speeds up or slows down can speed up or slow down society if society chooses to go onto arboreal or specifically onto bristlecone time. So the project is, on the one hand, very much up on Mount Washington working with dendrologists on trying to build a calendar. It also is a collaboration with the Nevada Museum of Art, creating a clock that uses an apparatus on the mountain, calibrating the clock based on the real-time growth of a tree, that then becomes the basis for a time protocol. You can put your smartwatch on to bristlecone time, and also a time standard. I'm working with the Earth Law Center out of Boulder, Colorado, on making a new time standard, legally enforceable as such, equally legitimate to the time standard that we're accustomed to, and to really, I think, challenge what we think about and how we consider ourselves in relation to the planet, in relation to time. Because the moment that you go onto bristlecone time, the time kept by the Gregorian calendar or the atomic clock becomes irregular. And I don't know that one is right and the other is wrong. I don't think that you can really say ultimately that one is more correct than the other. I think that we need the flexibility of mind to be able to navigate in the times that we live in right now, and that flexibility of mind is both in terms of being able to think at different scales, as I mentioned earlier, and also is a matter of being able to experience the here and now with a degree of sensitivity that we have lost because we're so disembodied from and so distant from nature in so many ways in our cities. And yet we need simultaneously to be able to maintain some sort of a broader perspective on what we're doing and the effect that it has, to have some sort of a larger plan, as Hilairy alluded to get out of the standard political cycles. So all of that is attempted through creating something that is potentially a provocation, as I said earlier, but potentially also is a tool, as an instrument, a philosophical instrument for calibrating society itself.
So for anybody at home who's new to the Broto concept, it's really about the merger of art and science coming together substantively, creatively, mutual, real-time, experimentally, to try and innovate around some of these ideas so that we can create something new, perhaps a solution to the climate crisis, so at least some new inspiration and some new ideas. And the kinds of information that we're talking about here is rare, I think, in the art or the climate space. And people like Hilairy, who's an open-minded scientist, where do you think art gives you some perspective on this topic?
So, thanks, Ian. I appreciate the question. I think that art and science are equally valid ways of making sense of the world around us, right? Science can't explain everything right now. And scientists who say we can explain everything are probably to be doubted a little bit, right? If we knew everything, we wouldn't be doing science, right? There wouldn't be research to be done. And when we don't understand something, or we find ourselves emotionally connected to a result, which I think science should be emotionally connected to our results, right? There's no such thing as an objective inquiry into something. We realize that what we're studying is beautiful, or that what we see in a pattern or a regular sequence is pleasing, right? And that's very much the same thing that happens when we either do a piece of art or we experience a piece of art. And I think we need to begin to kind of pull together multiple ways of knowing the world that we're in, because the problems we face in terms of, say, climate change or food security, or dare I say it right now, global health,
right,
are wicked problems. They're going to take many different perspectives to think about. And science is only one of those things. And I think art is underappreciated in terms of how it can engage the public, who we need in thinking about what outcomes are going to be like. So I'm really interested in how do we get artists and scientists to co-produce ways of understanding the world, right? Not just that art should be illustrating my data, because that doesn't make any sense. And I'm not saying that I should necessarily be doing art, because I don't feel like I have that in me sometimes. But working with artists and talking with artists, I think of different ways to frame what I do and different ways to make what I do potentially relevant for people, right?
Excellent. So Nick, at the Long Now, do you have a way for art and science to speak to each other in a way that is meaningful or constructive?
We do. I think that's one of the unique advantages of Long Now is we're a multidisciplinary organization, kind of outside of all the usual spaces. Even inside the nonprofit world, we're a little strange. Try writing a grant for something that's going to take 1,000 years, and you'll realize how slightly different that is. But it's a place where artists and scientists seem to be equally called to gather. either at the Interval, which is our cocktail bar meets museum meets floor-to-ceiling two-story library in San Francisco, which Jonathon had mentioned a little bit. He gave a talk there. So whether it's people gathering at the Interval or for one of the event series that we host, we have like a monthly speaking series, or any of these other projects, anything that gathers these folks together, you get a dialogue going, and you get this kind of discursive world building around how we think about time differently. What kind of interesting things can we do from a science side, from an art side? And so it's nice to have a space like that that's not quite so siloed. You're not talking to a bunch of people who think about the world the same way you do. It's a really diverse discourse that we're kind of constellating around the Long Now Foundation. And that speaking series has included a lot of prominent scientists and a lot of prominent artists like Jonathon. And so we've had people coming back and forth to present to this audience from both of these worlds, which I think Hilairy made a really good point. This is something of an artificial delineation between these two worlds, right? Like when unless you're being dogmatic about one of these things, these really do kind of it's human, it's the ways that humans are exploring what's around us and trying to make sense of it and understand it. And there's a reason to reach for all of these different tools. And so, yeah, for us, I think the art projects can be really interesting. The long science is fascinating. It's a really hard world of science. It's hard to fund. It's hard to make arguments for. So again, these artistic arguments are really kind of helping support the scientific arguments. The scientific arguments are really helping support the artistic arguments. But some of the most interesting long-term thinkers I've met have been real hardcore disciplined scientists, and I'm blown away by just the way they think. So long-term thinking, which is what Long Now is trying to kind of advocate for in the world, trying to help people think long-term. There are some people in the world that can do this really well. Science fiction authors are really good at it, but these, like the dendrochronologists that Jonathon mentioned, who've been working on the bristlecone pine trees and our Nevada property, amazing. Jonathon and I were actually on a trip to this mountain property in Nevada, and we were sitting around the campfire with a dendrochronologist, and Jonathon had mentioned this spiral of like concrete pillars or monoliths around a bristlecone pine tree, and the dendrochronologist just kind of stares into the fire and says, yeah, but on the timescales we're working on, all these things are just going to tumble and slide down the mountain. And you could see in that moment that his brain saw the soil that we were standing on as which seemed about as firm as anything in my human experience. He saw it as fundamentally just falling down the mountain at a rate that just wasn't perceptible. And so when you start thinking about this, and Jonathon's clock is going to be keeping time on a millennia time scale, he's like, yeah, that won't work, where this whole thing is going to be. And so just watching people who have that facility is really inspiring. And so the other thing we want to do is just find people who can do that and kind of put them on a stage so that other people can see what good long-term thinking looks like and the kinds of affordances it grants you for action. If you can see how things are going to change on millennium timescales or even geologic timescales, Hilairy, it's like even if you're looking at that, then all of a sudden you can start to creatively and effectively decide how you're going to do things today such that something's going to happen down the line. And we need that, again, for everything from public health to climate change and everything in between. So it's an interesting thing to behold when people do it.
So that's a great way to wrap up. I wanted to say thank you to Hilairy, Jonathon, Nick, for taking time to play with us on these ideas. I hope you attend some of our other sessions. We have 6 more after this that are all about some of the big ideas, these mind-blowing ideas that you've started us down the road on. And for anybody at home, if you're finding that this is good value for us, for you and for us, that consider a donation. This is a free conference, but we have hard costs, and we would really be grateful for a couple of dollars. So think about that, and please enjoy the rest of the conference. I want to say thanks again to our panel, and more to come. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Ian.
So hi, everybody. Hopefully you're receiving this. We are live now with the ability to answer and questions. So please bring forward your questions through the Q&A section, and we look forward to interacting. Just to the panel, what's your feedback on the first 33 minutes?
I thought it was great. It was really fun to hear it again and kind of reflect on some of the things that you sometimes miss in the moment of a conversation. There's this interesting sort of temporal wrinkle in getting to relive a kind of an exciting conversation again.
I was really struck the second time about John's concept of temporal fluency, this idea of having multiple time scales at which one is just kind of comfortable operating in. I think I missed that the first time around, or it didn't land quite as hard. So I really appreciated that contribution, John.
I'm always interested in art and science when they come together, and the conversations that ensue. They are inevitably unpredictable and generative, and so I'm just really excited to have started a conversation that I hope continues into the far future, maybe even geologically.
So
Go ahead, Hilairy.
So I had this moment and I wrote it down, this idea that if you think of time fluency, you might need a translator. And I had this realization that the bristlecone time is kind of it's a translator between rock time that we perceive as not moving and our time, which we perceive as moving very quickly. And so this idea that there is Earth time, bristlecone time, human time is really this kind of lovely sequencing that I hadn't recognized before.
I think translator and also maybe mediator. I think maybe there's a way in which there's a way in which the tree not only is serving us by virtue of giving us a transcript or potentially giving Gaia some sort of feedback of what we're doing, but also that maybe there's some more active role that potentially comes into play, which I think is what I'm attempting to achieve by giving authority in this human sense of the word to trees as means by which we are calibrated.
Mm-hmm.
And the bristlecone pine trees in particular are the perfect mediator between human time and geological time. In fact, these bristlecone pine trees have been described as almost more like stones than like trees. If you've ever seen one, they're all gnarled, they're very solitary, and our executive director, Alexander Rose, often says it's not so much that they're the longest lived non-clonal organism on planet Earth, but that it's the slowest dying organism. It just takes the longest time to die. And so they weather like stones in the rain and the wind. And so, yeah, they're very much right in the middle of these two temporalities. Perfect translator.
There are bristlecone cabins on the Long Now property that I don't know how they made them, given how hard that wood is, but those cabins will certainly be there long after any building here in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of interest in the bristlecones from our audience. I'm wondering if there's anything else you can say about them that would help figure out how these timekeepers could be more relevant.
Well, I think it's interesting. The dendrochronologists that Jonathon's been working with and that Long Now Foundation works with on our mountain property in Nevada, they will core these trees to get records of time in the same way that Hilairy had mentioned coring sediment layers. And so there's a sense in which going deep within these bristlecone pine trees is very much kind of going back in time in the historical record of what's happened. I think it's interesting, again, these different time scales of the geologic, the bristlecone pine tree, and the human. There's this sense that we have a memory that we can remember, last summer or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And that's a very human way of recording things. But then, of course, these trees are also recording events, marking the time in their own way, as is the sediment layers that Hilairy works with.
I think this also creates an interesting transition in terms of the absolute, the way in which we construe ourselves as being different in kind from every other organism and from everything else. And I think that there's suggested here, there's a sort of a more of a transition. So if we think about memory, and we use the word memory without anthropomorphizing those trees, but nevertheless recognize that memory is not something that is so specific to humans, or so specific even to organisms with a central nervous system, that there is memory that can be found in trees. And again, the idea of Gaia, or of Earth systems, of this total living quality to the planet, and the ways in which organisms, microorganisms in particular, and more than any other, are contributing to what ultimately is manifested in the sediment, and the ways in which erosion processes and other processes make sediment accessible, and therefore make biochemical environments accessible to future generations of bacteria, for example. There's a way in which there is memory and recollection that's taking place, and I'm not just speaking metaphorically. I think that one of the great challenges of the Anthropocene is the fact of our seeing ourselves as being exceptional somehow, and I think that we need to reintegrate ourselves into the world, and that means temporally, but it also means in terms of all the other special status we've accorded ourselves over the last hundreds and thousands of years.
We have a couple of questions from our friends Elena and Urania about how we can help to facilitate deep time thinking in the general public. Do you guys have any thoughts on how to make this a mainstream idea?
Yeah, I think one of the easiest ways is just by facilitating conversations like this, entering into a discourse about what people think about time and temporalities on different time scales. Sometimes it's just the reminder you need, sometimes you're working through a problem or a challenge and somebody says, well, how would this problem space change if we gave this 50 years or 500 years? And one of the things we've noticed with long-term thinking is that a lot of the problems that, if I gave you 5 years to solve, and it would seem impossible. Like, so take world hunger, for example, right? If I said, Ian, you got 5 years, unlimited budget, 5 years to solve world hunger, you'd, in a certain sense, be kind of paralyzed because you can't solve these kinds of problems on a 5-year timescale, or of course, more relevant to this climate change, right? This isn't the kind of thing that we're going to be able to get a grip on inside of, these short timescales. But what if I told you we had 500 years to solve it? Well, the same kind of problem seems almost inevitably solved on a 500-year time scale. There really is no other option for us. So then the question becomes, okay, well, how do we get it started? And I think Hilairy alluded to this in our initial conversation, but I really like this idea that that our culture could use a dose of emphasis on projects where you're just getting something started, but you don't feel obligated to finish it necessarily within your lifetime. So right now we're kind of awash in these narratives and stories in which somebody kind of solves a problem, finishes it, and then goes off to solve a second problem inside of one lifetime. But where are the stories, or where is our cultural capital accruing to stories where people are just kicking things off, or maybe just keeping things going, passing that torch from one generation to the next? If we're going to do the kind of problem solving we need to do to tackle things like climate change, we're going to need to get good at multi-generational problem solving. And that's going to mean just these different kinds of narratives. So I think one of the other ways is just thinking about what roles you can play in other institutions that are multi-generational. How do you pass the torch between these things and keep the problem space going?
I think it's also activations. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry about that.
Go ahead, Hilairy.
Yes, no, please.
I think another important aspect of this is that this idea of starting something, a lot of times in the face of a big problem, we are overwhelmed with the scale and rapidly go to, we can't do anything about it. And I think we need to start to get people to think about the idea that any step we take, small, big, personal, national, any step we take is part of the sequence of time. It will get us to a different future if we do something different today. And those steps can be, today I decided that I was going to stay inside as opposed to go out and deal with a whole bunch of people. And so there is a now component to the long now, to geologic time, to thinking about the future, because we are part of the system, right? We are in the timeline. And so all of our actions matter for the future. And some things are more urgent today, this week, next week, right? We have a virus to fix. We have a bunch of biochemistry to do. But we have to get used to the idea that we are part of the system. We are not separate. We may have invented the concept of time, but time exists as a vector that we are within. And we have to be in the moment and know that our moments string together to be what our future is going to be. And we have to just start to think about the fact that what we do matters. We have agency. And I think we lose that somewhere.
There's a question about Cape Cod.
Just to give you one more angle on this, because
Sure.
I think that it relates to what both of you have said a moment ago, and that is that I think in addition to narratives and in addition to the ways in which those narratives and even the institutions that support them can provide a sense of agency, I think that it also really comes down to activations, ways in which there are, whether it's a clock of the long now, whether it is a calendar that is calibrated by the bristlecone pine tree, or as was alluded to in the introduction, cameras that I've been building with an exposure time of 1,000 years, where people in a millennium will be able to see all that transpired in a single image, all the decisions that we made as a result of, or as a result of all the decisions that we made, to see the image that accrues, and therefore for us to be able to see ourselves from that vantage, from the far future. I think that these kinds of phenomena or of places out in the world, these activation points out in the world are really crucial in terms of giving us a groundedness to the future in relation to the present. And we need more of that. And Ian and I are going to bring it to Provincetown sometime soon, right?
Yes, let's put it on record. For people at home, we have a question about Cape Cod and the Pilgrims, who was here before the Pilgrims arrived 400 years ago. It's a very good question, and it's one we grapple with, in that the Wampanoag people, the Aboriginal people from this region, have lived here for 12,000 years. So that's a scale that few of our civilizations can think of. And also, if we think about geologic time, this little spit of land that we live on here in Provincetown and Cape Cod is 25,000 years old, dating back to the last ice age. So it's time is relevant to whoever you are, I think, or wherever you are. So
It seems like we may have lost Ian's connection a little bit.
All right. Well, I can still hear you, Hilairy. I think that's really interesting. He's mentioning 25,000-year history of Cape Cod geologically. That's a time scale that even stretches my brain quite a bit. And I'm curious. I don't think we got to hear a whole lot about your work in this space, or I think there's probably some work in the space that you didn't get a chance to talk about in the session. But I'm just fascinated. I would love to learn some more.
So it's funny, I think of myself as being either a deep time sort of early Earth person or a relatively modern processes person. I don't have a whole lot in the kind of 10 to 20,000, 100,000 year time scale.
Oh, we got you covered there.
That's awesome. In the very early Earth concept, we are really interested in understanding how the Earth became habitable, right? How did the Earth go from being a hot, melty, rocky mess in the Hadean, which is so long ago that even I can't really wrap my head around it, to the, habitable planet that we have now. And Earth has been inhabited almost from the moment that it cooled down to having liquid oceans and solid rocks, right? The rock record shows us that there's evidence for life back well into 3 billion years ago and more. But life evolves, right? We are part of the system, right? Organisms and bacteria evolved right along with the planet. As the planet evolved to the place we have now with continents and oceans, life evolved, co-evolved with the planet. And so as we see in the record, huge changes, right? I talked in the presentation about oxygen evolved around, lots of oxygen evolved around 2.5 billion years ago. And planet was forced to change, right? Organisms had to develop literally the antioxidants we talk about as being good for us in order to deal with all the oxygen in the atmosphere. That oxygen, once organisms learned to use it to respire carbon, provides huge energy. Well, now there's enough energy to support multicellular life, and there's enough energy to support huge forests and for a while dinosaurs, and then humans with our big brains and our capacity. And so this evolution of the planet and these massive, really geochemical evolutionary steps have allowed us to develop into the thing we are now. And we are just as much a part of the planet as we ever were.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So from the Archean standpoint, I'm really interested in how the geological processes, right, volcanism and changes in the, for lack of, I'll just say it, the redox state of the planet, how oxidized or reducing it was chemically, allowed life to get a toehold and allowed life to oxidize the atmosphere and produce oxygen.
Well, I like how you keep circling back to this embeddedness that we have in time, that though there is this longer time scale, we're still very much in it. We're both of it in the sense that we've inherited all of this, that we are the product of all of these, 4.5 billion years worth of events going on. But then at the same time, again, we're looking forward, we're looking into the future a little bit further. And one of the questions that keeps popping up in the chat is focused on this idea of the contrast between emergency moments, like what's immediately present to us right now, the kinds of problems we have to solve here and now, and how do we think about that, next to these deeper time challenges. And for me, I think of some of our exigencies of the present moment, like the one we're going through right now, with of course the outbreak of coronavirus. I think a lot of these things have deep time components to them. There's a long now kind of civilization scale challenge behind some of these things. And of course, climate change is one of these, right? And so the time to start addressing these things really was a while ago, before they became problems that broke the surface of our awareness. But the second best time for us to address these things is now. So getting started on some of these long-term projects is actually, it's both a way of addressing the emergencies that we're in, but it's also a way of kind of heading off the emergencies for future people, in a sense that I wish people would have headed off certain emergencies for me. So some of the exigencies that I experienced as exigencies were actually long-term problems for other people that were here before I was. So how do I pay that forward? Because there's a bunch of problems that didn't break the surface because people did address them. I think about this every time I go over the Golden Gate Bridge here in San Francisco, just what an infrastructural investment that was for people to do. And, without the Golden Gate Bridge, if you know the Bay Area geography, it's really a long trip to get around. But it's so short now that we have just, some infrastructure. And so I'm so grateful to the people that saw that as a worthwhile activity, and it saved so much time for me and so many others here in the Bay Area. What are the projects like these infrastructural projects that are out there for us to get started on? So that's how I kind of square the circle between the exigencies of the moment and the bigger picture.
Yeah,
it's interesting to see triage in multiple time frames and multiple time scales. I mean, in a sense, the Great Oxygenation Event and how life evolved to cope with it, that was triage. It was triage over a span of time considerably longer than the current government tends to think about. But I think that we need to think about emergency in many different timescales in terms of the problem and how we address it.
Mm-hmm. I like to frame it for people a little bit at the risk of being overly simplistic, right? If you own a house, you do long-term maintenance. You plan for how that structure is going to exist in 10 or 15 years. You still mow your grass. You still do all the stuff you have to do every day. And when stuff breaks, you fix it. And so you kind of approach this structure, right, which is critical to your well-being at all times on many time scales. And I think we need to think that way about the planet. And it's that connection to the planet that I think ties into climate as we're discussing it, and which is where we need other ways to kind of conceptualize it, right? Because every time I talk to the public about managing the planet or our connection to the planet, people are like, what? So maybe that's where art comes in. Maybe that's where these long-term conversations between different disciplines can help.
Well, there's a conceptual framework that we're kind of touching on here, but that's central to the Long Now Foundation. And it was started by the founder of the Long Now Foundation, or one of them, Stuart Brand, which is a concept called pace layers. So if anybody out there isn't familiar with the concept of pace layers, I encourage you just to open up a tab and check it out. Basically, the idea is that there are all these different temporalities. Kind of, you can think of it as stacked on top of each other. You can almost think of it as a sedimentary metaphor, right? And then at the top of this, the top surface, you have things like fashion, fads, the things that are moving very quickly, but they don't make much of a ding in the grander scheme of things, right? So you think of like Tamagotchis and Beanie Babies and whatever other kind of flashy, faddish thing is happening. You think about that as floating up at the surface, but below that you have things like commerce, or like infrastructure and governance, and eventually at the very, very bottom you have nature, this thing that's moving very, very slowly. And all these different layers, they're operating in their own timescales, but there's really interesting stuff that happens in the liminal friction zones between these layers. And so that's where you can look for some, you can kind of start to think about how is a fashion trying to become commercially viable? Or you can think about the intersection between like governance and infrastructure. And what are the tensions and frictions there that can sometimes be generative frictions. So the pace layers diagram, I think, is a really good way to think about some of these overlapping temporalities and understanding just what is the appropriate pace layer for you to be operating in. And sometimes the question is, I should be addressing this problem lower. So for us, Long Now Foundation, we're trying to address this way of understanding time, but we're trying to address it at the layer of culture. We're really trying to change the culture of how we talk about now, to include the long now, of course. And so that's an interesting change, because there's also, you can think of, there's probably faddish solutions, very like quick and fashionable solutions. There's probably a lot of commercial solutions. And I think we need people operating at all these scales in harmony, but I think that's a good way of helping think about these different time scales.
So with time ticking on, we have a 60-minute hard stop for everybody at home. We're not going to get to all the questions, which is a good problem to have. I'm sorry for anybody we haven't been able to get to. Please send me an email and we will try and follow up that way at ian@Broto.eco. In the meantime, I want to say thank you to our panelists. Is there anything one last sentence to send people off on what deep time and climate can mean? Hilairy?
Oh, so much to say. I want to remind people that we are the future, right? The future won't be anything that we don't create. And so that gives us both agency and power.
Hey, Jonathan? Last thought?
Yes, I think that we need to take up the challenge of multiple layers, as Dick alluded to earlier, as something that can activate us to move between those layers and to recognize how each of those layers actually embeds all the others. And we need to operate at all scales all at once.
And Nick, anything last and quick?
And in operating in all those scales all at once, we, I think, can really be good ancestors. And I just want to underscore that that's something we can do and we're trying to do. If anybody has any curiosity about the work that we're doing at Long Now, we're at longnow.org. I'd love it for you to come check out some of our work, whether it's the Clock Project, the membership program, the bar in San Francisco, whatever it is. Please don't be a stranger.
All right. Thank you very much for a great first panel, even with all the technical glitches. We are live and this is part of it, so thank you very much. I want to say, please join us for the next panel at 2:30 Eastern Time for Time is a Muse. So,
thanks for having me in.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.